The evening was quiet and the streets were not too crowded. General Alicia Carter was driving home after a long day of meetings at the base. She was dressed in her military uniform, the same uniform that carried medals and badges that told the story of her years of service. She was a woman of discipline, respect, and authority. Every soldier who had ever worked under her admired her. She had been on the battlefield, she had made decisions that saved lives, and she carried herself with the calm confidence of someone who had faced the worst and survived. As she drove through the town, she hummed softly to herself, enjoying the rare moment of peace. But that peace did not last long. In her rearview mirror, she noticed flashing red and blue lights. A police car was speeding up behind her. At first, she thought it must be chasing someone else, but soon it became clear. The car was signaling for her to pull over. Alicia was surprised. She had not broken any laws. She was not speeding, and her driving was careful as always. Still, she pulled her vehicle to the side of the road because that was the law, and she respected the law even when it made no sense. The police car stopped behind her, and 2 officers stepped out. They moved quickly with sharp, suspicious eyes as if they were already convinced she had done something wrong. Alicia rolled down her window and waited calmly, hands visible on the steering wheel, just as she had been taught to do during traffic stops. The first officer leaned in and said, "License and registration?" His voice was cold, and his eyes darted around the car like he was searching for hidden danger. Alicia gave a polite nod and handed over her documents. The second officer stood by, one hand resting on his belt near his weapon, his stare sharp and unwelcoming. Alicia tried to remain calm, but she could feel the tension in the air. She had dealt with difficult situations before, but there was something different here. It was not about safety, it was about prejudice. She could see it in their eyes. They were not looking at her as a decorated general or even as a law-abiding citizen. They were looking at her skin, at her gender, and forming their own biased judgment. "Where are you going?" the first officer asked, his tone almost like an interrogation. "Home," Alicia answered simply. "What's your business in this town?" he pressed, ignoring the fact that her address was clearly on the license he was holding. "I live here," she replied. Keeping her voice steady, the officer smirked, shaking his head slightly as if he didn't believe her. "Step out of the car," he ordered. Alicia felt a spark of anger rise inside her, but she suppressed it. She had spent years in the military learning to keep her emotions under control. She knew that anger in this situation could be dangerous. So, she unbuckled her seatbelt, opened the door, and stepped out slowly. The evening air was cool, and a small crowd of pedestrians began to notice what was happening. People slowed down, curious to see why a woman in uniform was being stopped like a criminal. One of the bystanders whispered, "That's General Carter." But the officers ignored the murmurs. The second officer circled her car, checking the back seat, while the first one looked Alicia up and down with a mixture of suspicion and arrogance. "What are you doing in uniform?" he asked mockingly, as if wearing her official attire was some kind of disguise. "I am on duty," Alicia said firmly. "I am a general in the United States Army." Instead of respecting her, the officer chuckled. "A general? That's a new one. You expect us to believe that?" Alicia felt a wave of disbelief. Here she was in full uniform with clear identification, and yet these men refused to see the truth. It wasn't that they couldn't see it. It was that they didn't want to. To them, she could not possibly be who she claimed to be. Their prejudice had already blinded them. The crowd nearby started to record on their phones. The situation was tense now, and everyone could feel it. Alicia stood tall, refusing to let their doubt break her composure. Years of discipline kept her steady, even as humiliation pressed down on her shoulders. "Turn around," the first officer ordered. "Hands behind your back," Alicia's heart sank. She knew what was about to happen. She had led soldiers through dangerous missions. She had been saluted by thousands, but now, on this quiet street, she was about to be handcuffed like a common criminal. She wanted to protest, to shout, to remind them of who she was, but something inside told her to stay calm. This moment was bigger than her pride. As the cold metal cuffs clicked around her wrists, Alicia's mind raced. She thought of her soldiers, of the battles she had fought, of the dignity she had always carried. She thought of the people watching now, capturing every second. She realized this encounter was no longer just hers. It was becoming a story that would ripple far beyond this street. The officers thought they were in control, But Alicia knew something they didn't. She knew that one phone call could change everything. And though they treated her with disrespect, she would not allow herself to be broken. This was only the beginning of a storm that would turn against them. She stood silent, handcuffed, her eyes steady, her pride unshaken. Deep inside, she knew justice was not far away. The cuffs bit into Alicia's wrists, cold metal pressing against her skin. She had faced combat zones, stood against enemies with weapons far deadlier than handguns. Yet in this moment, she felt a sting of humiliation sharper than any battlefield wound. A general in the United States Army, reduced to a spectacle on the side of the road. The officers did not slow down. They barked orders as if she were a dangerous criminal, their voices carrying across the street. "Walk to the back of the car," one demanded. His tone wasn't just commanding. It was mocking, almost daring her to resist. Alicia moved with calm steps, her boots steady on the pavement. Her posture, even with her hands bound, carried authority. People watching from the sidewalks whispered among themselves. Some were horrified, others outraged, but no one dared to step forward. Their phones, however, were raised higher, capturing every second. The younger officer, the one who had kept his hand near his weapon, leaned in close. "So you're telling us you're some big-shot general? In this uniform? What you think wearing a costume makes you above the law?" His sneer made it clear. He saw her not as an officer, not even as a person, but as someone he had already judged guilty. Alicia met his stare. Her eyes didn't flinch, didn't waver. "This is no costume," she said evenly. "I have earned every badge, every medal. And I do not answer to you, I answer to my country." Her voice was calm but firm, strong but not shouting, and that only seemed to make him angrier. He wasn't used to defiance delivered with such dignity. "Don't play games with me," he snapped, pressing her shoulder roughly. "You think being clever is going to help you here? You're under arrest for resisting lawful orders." The irony cut deep. She had obeyed every order, every instruction, even when they made no sense. Yet they twisted her compliance into something else, because they needed a reason to justify their prejudice. The crowd murmured louder now. Someone called out, "She's a general. Let her go." Another voice followed, "We know who she is. You're making a mistake." But the officers shut them out, too proud or too blind to admit they were wrong. Alicia's mind flickered back to moments from her past. She remembered standing in front of soldiers half her size and twice her doubt, commanding them with nothing but the strength of her voice. She remembered salutes from generals higher than her rank, acknowledgments of her worth. And now, two small-town cops, blinded by arrogance, were trying to strip her of that worth. One officer shoved her slightly toward the hood of the car. "Face down," he ordered. "You're being detained for questioning." "On what grounds?" Alicia asked quietly, her voice steady. The officer smirked. "We'll figure that out later." Those words cut through the air like a blade. Even the bystanders gasped. Everyone knew what that meant. This wasn't about justice. This was about power, about control, about showing her that for now they believed they held the upper hand. Alicia took a slow breath. She had to think carefully. She knew reacting in anger could escalate things further. These men were already wound tight, looking for an excuse to push her harder. But she also knew she couldn't remain silent forever. She had a weapon more powerful than theirs, not one of steel but of connection. She had the Pentagon behind her, and with one call she could remind them who she truly was. But not yet. Timing was everything. The officer's radio crackled, but he ignored it. He was too focused on his prize, humiliating a woman who had already accomplished more than he ever would. He pulled out a small notepad, scribbling nonsense as if it gave him authority. Driving suspiciously, possible stolen vehicle, possible impersonation of an officer. He muttered loud enough for Alicia and the crowd to hear. It was a show, a lie built in front of witnesses so that later he could claim he had reason. Alicia raised her chin slightly, her voice cutting through the tension. "Every word you speak now will follow you for the rest of your life. Choose carefully. It wasn't a threat. It was the truth." And something about the way she said it unsettled him. For a brief moment his eyes flickered with doubt. But then pride slammed the door shut again and he barked another order. "Search the car," he yelled to his partner. The second officer moved quickly, opening doors, digging through her belongings, tossing folders and personal items carelessly onto the ground. Inside one folder was a sealed document, marked with Pentagon insignia. He lifted it up, squinting before tossing it aside like trash. The crowd gasped again. They could see the proof of who she was, but the officers refused to acknowledge it. To admit they were wrong now would mean admitting their actions were prejudice-driven, and that they could not do. Alicia stood silent but unshaken. Every second her humiliation grew, but so did her resolve. These men thought they were in control, but the longer this went on, the deeper they dug their own grave, because she knew something they didn't. The world was watching, and the world would not stay silent. And soon, she would make the call that would change everything. The handcuffs clinked as Alicia Carter was forced toward the hood of her own car. The officers pressed her down roughly, ignoring the whispers and gasps of the people who had gathered. To them, she was not a decorated general, not a leader who had stood on battlefields for her country. She was simply another target of their suspicion. The cold steel of the hood met her cheek, and she felt the sharp sting of disrespect more than the sting of the metal. Her uniform, which represented years of service, sacrifice, and honor, was creased and shoved against dirty surfaces without care. Her dignity was being stripped away in plain sight, and the worst part was how deliberate it felt. The officers weren't simply doing their jobs. They were making a statement. They wanted her small, powerless, and ashamed. Around them, phones were raised higher. Every second was being recorded. Some people shouted, others stayed quiet, unsure if stepping closer might put them at risk. The whole street seemed to freeze, as though the city itself held its breath. One child tugged at his mother's hand and whispered, "Mom, why are they hurting the soldier?" The woman hushed him quickly, but her eyes never left the scene. The younger officer leaned over Alicia, his breath hot with arrogance. "You think that uniform makes you special? Out here it's meaningless. You answer to us now." Alicia did not reply. She had learned long ago that silence could sometimes be louder than words. Still, inside her chest, anger burned like fire. She had faced enemies who tried to break her spirit with guns and threats, but somehow, this moment, being handcuffed by her own countrymen, cut deeper. The second officer, still rummaging through her belongings, pulled out her service cap and held it up mockingly for the crowd. "Look at this," he laughed. "She really thinks she's somebody." He tossed the cap to the ground like trash. The crowd groaned in disapproval, some even shouting for them to stop, but the officers carried on, deaf to reason. Alicia's eyes followed the cap on the pavement. That cap had been with her through ceremonies, parades, and moments of honor. Seeing it treated so carelessly felt like a slap across the face. The humiliation grew heavier with every second. She could feel the weight of the cuffs, the eyes of strangers, the sneers of the men who thought they had the right to tear her down, and yet she stood taller inside. She would not let them see her spirit crack. "Check her car again," the younger officer barked. "There's no way she's clean. People like this don't just drive around without trouble. People like this." The words echoed in Alicia's mind. She knew exactly what he meant. Not soldiers, not generals, not citizens. No, he meant something else. He meant her skin, her gender, her very existence. It was not about justice. It was never about justice. It was about prejudice dressed in a badge and uniform. A man in the crowd finally stepped forward, his voice firm. "Officers, I know who she is. That's General Carter. She served this country for decades. You're making a mistake." The officer turned sharply, pointing a finger. "Step back, sir, unless you want to be next." The man hesitated, his courage shrinking under the threat, but the crowd buzzed louder now. They weren't fooled. They could see the truth with their own eyes. Alicia closed hers for a moment, taking a deep breath. She thought of her soldiers, of the young recruits she had once told, "Never let anyone take your dignity, no matter what they do to your body." Now those words came back to her like a shield. They could cuff her wrists, they could smear her name, they could mock her service, but they could not touch her soul. The younger officer pressed on, eager to pile on more humiliation. "Get on your knees," he commanded. The crowd erupted in outrage. "No," someone shouted. "This is wrong." Another yelled, "She's a hero. You can't do this." But the officer's pride only swelled with defiance. He was blind to the fact that every second of this was being captured from multiple angles. He was deaf to the voices crying out against his actions. All he saw was a woman he refused to respect. Alicia lowered herself slowly, her knees touching the hard ground. Not because she accepted their authority, but because she knew something they didn't. Every moment they tried to humiliate her, every order they barked, every insult they spat, it was all being documented. And when the truth came out, the humiliation would not be hers, it would be theirs. Her eyes rose toward the people recording. She didn't say a word, but her gaze was enough. It spoke louder than any protest could. It said, "Remember this. Remember me. The truth will come." One by one, people nodded as if they understood the silent message. The crowd was no longer just watching, they were witnesses. The officers, still lost in their arrogance, believed they had won this battle. But Alicia knew the war was only beginning, because soon with a single call the world would know what had happened here, and the shame they tried to force upon her would come crashing back on them with a weight they could never escape. The cuffs dug into Alicia's wrists as she knelt on the hard pavement. Her uniform was wrinkled, her cap tossed aside, and her dignity had been tested in front of strangers. The officers believed they had broken her, that their authority was absolute. But Alicia Carter was not a woman who broke easily. She had survived battlefields, made decisions under fire, and carried the weight of command when lives hung by a thread. Compared to those moments, this humiliation was just another trial. The younger officer leaned closer, smirking as though victory was his. "You're not going anywhere until we're done with you," he said. "You better get used to it." Alicia raised her head slowly, meeting his eyes with steady calm. "You've already made your mistake," she replied softly. "Now I'll make my call." The officer laughed. "Your call? To who? Your lawyer? Go ahead. It won't help you." But Alicia didn't argue. Instead, she shifted slightly, the handcuffs rattling as she reached into her pocket. The crowd held its breath, waiting. Even the officers hesitated, uncertain if they should stop her. But her steady confidence unsettled them just enough to let her continue. With her fingers bound, she managed to grip her phone. The screen lit up, and for the first time that night, power shifted, not in the hands of the officers, but in the hands of the woman they had tried to humiliate. She pressed a single number. One direct line. The phone rang once, twice. Then a voice answered, crisp and professional. "Pentagon Command Center. Identify yourself." Alicia spoke clearly, her voice steady despite the cuffs on her wrists and the officers looming over her. "This is General Alicia Carter. I am being unlawfully detained by local police. I require immediate assistance." The officer's smirk faltered. He blinked, then barked a laugh as though it were a joke. "Really, the Pentagon? You expect us to believe that?" But his laugh sounded weaker this time, uncertain. On the other end of the line, the voice sharpened. "General Carter, confirm location." Alicia lifted her chin, eyes locked on the crowd, her voice loud enough for the bystanders and the officers to hear. She gave the street name, the town, the exact coordinates. "Understood, General," the voice replied. "Stay on the line." "Assistance is en route." The officer standing over her paled, his jaw tightening. "Who the hell did you just call?" he demanded. "The people who outrank you," Alicia answered. The crowd erupted in whispers, phones trembling in their hands as they realized the truth. The woman in handcuffs wasn't lying. She wasn't pretending. She was exactly who she claimed to be, a general with direct access to the highest levels of power. The second officer, the one still pawing through her belongings, held up a folder with the Pentagon seal. His face drained of color. For the first time that night, doubt began to creep into their arrogance. But Alicia wasn't finished. She spoke into the phone again, her words calm but sharp as a blade. "Be advised I am in full uniform. Officers are disregarding my identification and mistreating me in public view. Civilians are recording. This is a clear act of misconduct." On the line, the voice responded with steel in its tone. "Acknowledged, General. Your report is logged. Backup is minutes away. Do not engage further." Alicia nodded once, closing her eyes briefly. The humiliation still burned, but now she held the higher ground. These men thought they had silenced her, but her voice had reached farther than they could imagine. The younger officer's hand twitched near his belt, torn between his pride and his fear. "You think you're scaring us with this little performance?" He snapped, but his words lacked the strength they had before. Alicia turned her head toward him, her voice steady as stone. "This isn't a performance. This is reality. And reality is about to arrive." The murmurs in the crowd grew louder. "She called the Pentagon," someone whispered. "She's really a general." Another voice added, "They're finished. This is going to ruin them." The officers exchanged nervous glances, the first cracks in their armor of arrogance appearing. The weight of their mistake pressed heavier with each passing second. Alicia remained still, her presence unshaken. She knew the Pentagon's call wasn't just sending help. It was sending accountability. Every action the officers had taken was now under a microscope. Every shove, every insult, every ounce of prejudice was being recorded not only by civilians, but by history itself. Minutes passed like hours. The street was silent except for the hum of engines in the distance. Then faintly at first, but growing louder, came the sound of multiple vehicles approaching fast. Black SUVs with tinted windows. Official plates. The crowd parted, whispering in awe. The officers froze. Their hands twitched. Their eyes darted, and their arrogance crumbled under the realization of what was coming. Alicia kept her head high, her phone still pressed against her ear. "Yes," she said quietly as the convoy came into view. "They're here." And in that moment, even in handcuffs, she was the one in command. The sound of engines grew louder, echoing off the quiet streets like rolling thunder. Black SUVs with government plates turned the corner, speeding toward the scene with flashing lights. Not police lights, but something heavier, more official. The crowd stirred, pressing closer, their phones raised high to capture every second. Everyone knew something extraordinary was about to unfold. The two officers stiffened. Their bravado faltered as the first SUV screeched to a halt. The doors opened and out stepped men and women in sharp suits, their movements fast, precise, and commanding. These were not ordinary officials. These were people who carried the Pentagon's authority in every stride. One of them, a tall man with silver hair and an earpiece, marched straight toward Alicia. His eyes took in the sight. The general on her knees, her wrists cuffed, her cap on the ground like trash, and his face hardened. "General Carter," he said, his voice loud enough for everyone to hear. "We're here." The officers blinked, their mouths opening slightly in disbelief. "General? Did he just call her general?" Their arrogance cracked, and for the first time fear slipped through. Alicia lifted her chin. Even in handcuffs, even kneeling on the pavement, she looked every bit the leader she was. "I reported unlawful detainment," she said calmly. "As you can see, the situation is ongoing." The man turned sharply to the officers. His voice was like thunder. "Remove those handcuffs immediately." The younger officer hesitated, his face pale. "So, sir, we were just—" "Now!" The official barked. The officer fumbled with the keys, his hands trembling. He unlocked the cuffs, and the sound of the metal snapping open echoed like a gavel in a courtroom. Alicia pulled her wrists free and straightened to her full height. Though her skin still bore red marks from the restraints, her presence radiated strength. She was no longer a detainee. She was the highest-ranking figure on that street. The crowd erupted in cheers and shouts. Some clapped, others called out her name. "General Carter!" one man yelled proudly. Phones zoomed in on her face, capturing the exact moment the balance of power shifted. The younger officer tried to salvage his pride. "We didn't know who she was," he stammered. She refused to cooperate, but the silver-haired official cut him off with a glare that could have pierced steel. "You had her identification. You had her uniform. You ignored the evidence and abused your authority. You humiliated a decorated general of the United States Army, and you did it in front of witnesses and cameras." The older officer swallowed hard, his voice barely a whisper. "We thought she was impersonating." "Impersonating?" The official's voice thundered. "You handcuffed a real general and accused her of being a fraud? Do you realize what you've done? Do you understand the gravity of this?" The younger officer's confidence shattered completely. Sweat ran down his face and his eyes darted nervously between Alicia and the official. The crowd, sensing their downfall, pressed closer, their whispers turning to pointed accusations. "They're finished," someone said. "Their careers are over." Alicia remained quiet, her silence more powerful than any angry words. She stood tall, her back straight, her eyes steady. She didn't need to shout. She didn't need to demand revenge. Her very presence spoke louder than anything else. Another black SUV pulled up, and this time uniformed military police stepped out. Their boots hit the pavement in unison, their faces cold and professional. The officer's eyes widened in terror. This was no longer a traffic stop. This was an investigation, one that could end their careers in an instant. The silver-haired official turned back to Alicia. His voice softened with respect. "General, please allow us to escort you. You should not endure another second of this disgrace." Alicia nodded, but before she moved, she looked at the officers one last time. Her gaze was calm, almost pitying. Power is not about who can shout the loudest or who wears the badge. True power comes with responsibility. You forgot that tonight, and now you will pay the price. The word struck deeper than any punishment. The officers stood frozen, their pride stripped away, their arrogance replaced by the cold realization that their actions had spiraled far beyond their control. The crowd roared with approval, some chanting her name, others jeering at the officers. Phones captured every angle. The officers' pale faces, the military police standing guard, and Alicia walking free with dignity. For the first time since the stop began, the officers looked small. The same men who had mocked and humiliated her now seemed powerless, trapped in the web of their own prejudice. Their authority had melted away, and in its place was fear. Fear of consequences, fear of exposure, fear of losing everything they thought was secure. As Alicia stepped toward the SUV waiting for her, the younger officer whispered under his breath, his voice trembling, "We're finished." He was right, because in that moment the shift had come. The world no longer saw Alicia as a detainee. They saw her as the wronged general, the victim of prejudice, the woman who stood tall in the face of humiliation. And they saw the officers not as protectors of the law, but as its betrayers. The shift was complete. The story was no longer theirs to control. It belonged to history now, and history would not be kind to them. Engines rumbled louder, shaking the air as more black SUVs rolled into the street. Their tinted windows reflected the flashing streetlights, and the sound of heavy tires grinding against the pavement made the crowd's murmurs fall into silence. The officers stiffened, their shoulders tightening as fear settled deeper into their bones. Doors swung open and out stepped men and women in immaculate suits, badges flashing under the glow of headlights. Their movements were sharp, practiced, and commanding. This wasn't a police response, it was the government itself arriving. And behind them, in perfect formation, a squad of military police emerged, their boots striking the ground in unison. The sound was crisp, powerful, like the march of justice itself. The crowd gasped. Some clapped, some cheered, and others simply held their phones higher, desperate to capture the moment. What had started as a routine traffic stop had turned into a spectacle, a confrontation between arrogance and authority, prejudice and truth. At the center of it all stood General Alicia Carter. She was no longer on her knees. She was no longer in handcuffs. She stood tall, her presence commanding, her uniform glowing with dignity despite the wrinkles and dust. The silver-haired official who had first arrived gestured toward her. "General Carter, your escort is here." The officers' faces drained of color as one of the military police stepped forward and saluted her sharply. "General, ma'am, we are at your service." Alicia returned the nod with quiet grace. The salute wasn't just protocol. It was a message to everyone watching. She was no suspect, no imposter, no criminal. She was exactly who she had claimed to be, a decorated leader of the United States Army. The younger officer's mouth opened, but no words came out. His eyes darted from Alicia to the military police, then back to the crowd. The weight of his mistake pressed down so heavily that he looked as if he might collapse under it. His partner tried to stand straighter, but his trembling hands betrayed him. One of the officials in a dark suit turned toward them. His voice was calm but sharp as glass. "Officers, do you understand what you've done?" The younger one stammered, We thought she was impersonating. We didn't what?" The official snapped. "Didn't see her uniform? Didn't check her identification? Didn't listen to her words? Or didn't want to believe her because your prejudice blinded you?" The words cut deeper than any weapon. The officers had no defense, no excuse that could undo what the crowd had already witnessed. The military police moved closer, forming a protective circle around Alicia. The crowd erupted with applause. Phones shook as people cheered her name. In their eyes, she wasn't just a general. She was a symbol standing tall against injustice. Alicia remained calm. She didn't bask in the cheers. She didn't gloat. She simply stood with dignity, letting the truth speak for itself. Her silence was more powerful than any accusation she could have shouted. A man in the crowd raised his phone and yelled, "It's going viral. The whole country's gonna see this." Others cheered in agreement. In that instant, Alicia knew her humiliation had been transformed into something greater. What had been meant to break her would now become proof. Proof of the arrogance of those who thought their badge placed them above respect, above fairness, above truth. One of the military police stepped toward the officers. His voice was like steel. "You will remain where you are. Internal Affairs and Pentagon investigators are en route. Do not move. The officers looked at each other, trapped. Their pride had vanished, replaced by raw panic. Only minutes ago they had barked orders with arrogance. Now they stood silent, waiting for judgment. The silver-haired official turned back to Alicia. General, you will be escorted directly to headquarters. The Secretary of Defense has already been briefed. This incident will not go unanswered. Alicia nodded once, her face unreadable. Inside she felt both a deep ache and a deep fire. They had tried to strip her dignity, but instead they had handed her a platform. This was no longer about her alone. It was about every soldier, every citizen who had ever been disrespected because of prejudice. As the military police guided her toward the waiting SUV, the crowd parted with respect. Some saluted her, others clapped, and many simply watched in awe. Children pointed and whispered, "She's a real general." The weight of the moment pressed itself into memory. This was history being written before their eyes. Behind her, the two officers stood frozen, their careers unraveling in silence. No amount of excuses could save them now. The arrival of those black SUVs had sealed their fate. Their arrogance had been replaced with shame, their power replaced with fear. Alicia paused before stepping into the vehicle. She turned back, her eyes sweeping across the scene. She didn't need to speak. The image was enough. A proud general walking away free, flanked by military police and government officials, while the men who tried to humiliate her stood broken under the weight of their mistake. The crowd roared once more as the SUV door closed behind her. The convoy engines started up again, their sound rolling through the night like thunder. Justice had arrived, and the men who once thought they held all the power finally understood. They had none. By morning, the world had already changed. What began as a quiet traffic stop on a dimly lit street had spread across millions of screens overnight. The videos, shaky but powerful, were everywhere. They showed every moment, the handcuffs clicking onto Alicia's wrists, her calm defiance, the officers' mocking laughter, and finally, the arrival of black SUVs and military police that turned the night upside down. On social media, her name trended at number 1, General Alicia Carter. People shared her story with outrage and admiration. Hashtags demanding justice spread like wildfire. Some clips were replayed on news channels, anchors shaking their heads in disbelief. Commentators called it a disgrace, a shameful example of prejudice at its ugliest. Others praised Alicia's composure, calling her a symbol of dignity under fire. The officers, once proud in their uniforms, woke up to find their faces plastered everywhere. Their sneers, their arrogance, their careless words, immortalized forever in recordings they could never erase. The captions were merciless, prejudice caught on camera. This is why accountability matters. Power abused, careers destroyed. At police headquarters, tension crackled like a storm. Internal Affairs moved quickly, collecting evidence, questioning witnesses, reviewing the hours of footage. They had no shortage of material. Dozens of angles, dozens of witnesses, every detail of the night laid bare. And the Pentagon? They weren't silent either. A formal investigation had been announced, the kind that carried real consequences, suspensions, firings, and perhaps even criminal charges. The officers sat in a small room, their badges already taken, their guns locked away. For the first time in their careers, they were powerless. No excuses, no authority to hide behind. Just two men stripped of pride, waiting for the verdict of a country that had already judged them. Meanwhile, Alicia Carter stood in a quiet office inside the Pentagon. The room was filled with officials, generals, and advisors, all of them leaning forward, listening as she spoke. She didn't raise her voice, didn't rant, didn't scream. She simply told the story of what had happened step by step, with the same calm composure she had shown on the street. And when they placed me in cuffs, she said softly, they did not see my uniform. They did not hear my rank. They saw only what they wanted to see. And that is the problem. The room fell silent. Her words carried weight heavier than steel. Outside, the public roared louder. Protests formed in front of the police station, citizens demanding change. Signs read, "Respect those who serve," "End prejudice in uniform," and "Justice for General Carter." Veterans groups rallied behind her. Soldiers sent in messages of support, and even world leaders took notice. A late-night talk show host summed it up perfectly. Imagine serving your country for decades, wearing the uniform with pride, only to be handcuffed by men too blind to see your worth. That's not just wrong, it's unforgivable. The fallout was not just professional, it was personal. Families of the officers faced questions they couldn't answer. Friends distanced themselves. Their community, once silent, turned cold. The very people they thought they were protecting looked at them now with anger and shame. Alicia, however, carried herself with grace. She didn't speak publicly at first. She didn't need to. The videos had already spoken for her. Instead, she visited the base, walking through rows of soldiers who saluted her with renewed respect. Her quiet strength had inspired not just civilians, but those who wore the uniform every day. One young soldier whispered as she passed, "That's who I want to be like." The Pentagon statement was clear. "We stand with General Alicia Carter." Her dignity and composure reflect the highest standards of military leadership. The actions against her were unacceptable and consequences will follow. And they did. By the end of the week, the officers were suspended indefinitely. Their names were on every headline, their careers reduced to cautionary tales. What they thought would be a simple traffic stop had become their downfall. For Alicia, the fallout was different. Her story had become bigger than her. She was no longer just General Carter, she was a symbol. A reminder that respect must be earned, that prejudice has consequences, and that silence in the face of injustice is never the answer. She hadn't asked for the spotlight. She hadn't wanted the fame. But fate had placed her there, and she carried it with the same dignity she carried her medals. And though the humiliation of that night would never leave her completely, neither would the strength she had shown, or the legacy it created. The fallout had destroyed the officers. But for Alicia Carter, it had built something far greater, a story that would outlive them all. The final blow did not come with handcuffs, sirens, or shouting crowds. It came quietly, with official letters stamped in red, sliding across a polished table in a small office. Two police officers sat across from a panel of stern faces, chiefs, investigators, and Pentagon representatives. Their hands shook as they reached for the papers, but even before they opened them, they knew what was inside: termination, effective immediately. Their badges, once symbols of pride, now lay on the desk between them. Their guns had already been taken days earlier. Now the very identity they had clung to, the authority they had abused, was gone. "You disgraced your positions," one investigator said coldly. "You ignored clear evidence. You abused a citizen, a decorated officer in uniform, and worst of all, you did it with arrogance." The younger officer tried to speak, his voice cracking. We didn't know, but the Pentagon representative cut him off." "You didn't want to know. That's the difference." Silence filled the room. For the first time, the two men truly felt the weight of their actions. They hadn't just humiliated a general, they had humiliated themselves, their department, and the very badge they once wore with pride. Outside the walls of that room, the world had already moved on. Their names had been dragged through headlines, their faces replayed endlessly in viral videos. The community they once patrolled no longer trusted them. Children who once waved at police cars now pointed and whispered. Friends turned away. Neighbors shook their heads. They were not officers anymore. They were reminders of failure. Meanwhile, General Alicia Carter stood in a packed hall at the Pentagon, surrounded by soldiers, officials, and journalists. Cameras flashed, microphones pointed toward her, but she didn't bask in the attention. She stood with quiet strength, her hands resting behind her back, her uniform pressed and shining once more. A speaker at the podium introduced her. "General Carter represents not just the strength of our armed forces, but the resilience of dignity in the face of injustice." The room erupted in applause. Some stood saluting her. Others simply clapped until their hands stung. Alicia bowed her head slightly in acknowledgement, but when she finally stepped forward to speak, her words were simple. "I did not ask for what happened to me, but it happened. And it revealed something greater than me. Prejudice is dangerous. Arrogance is dangerous. When those two things combine with power, the result is injustice. But justice does not stay silent. The truth always comes forward. Always." Her words carried across the hall, across the cameras, across the country. People listening at home felt it in their bones. It wasn't just a speech. It was a lesson, and the lesson had already taken root. Police departments across the nation began holding emergency meetings, reviewing policies, discussing training. Soldiers spoke of Alicia with pride, saying her strength in humiliation was a lesson they would carry into their own service. Ordinary citizens told her story at dinner tables, reminding their children that dignity matters, even when the world tries to strip it away. As for the officers, their punishment was not just losing their jobs. It was living in the shadow of their own actions. Every search of their names brought up the same videos, the same headlines, the same disgrace. They had not just ended their careers, they had burned them to ash. One night, months later, the younger officer sat alone in his small apartment, watching the video again. He watched himself sneer, laugh, dismiss her rank, and place cuffs on her wrists. He watched the crowd gasp. He watched the black SUVs arrive, and he watched the moment his face shifted from arrogance to fear. He closed the laptop and buried his head in his hands. There was no undoing it. No second chance. The world would never forget. Alicia Carter, however, did not spend her nights watching the past. She moved forward. She returned to her base, leading soldiers with the same discipline and care she always had. She never bragged about what happened. She didn't need to. The world had seen it. The world had judged it, and the world had remembered it. For her, the humiliation had been temporary. For them, it was forever. The story that began with flashing lights on a quiet street ended with 2 broken men and 1 unshaken general. The officers had destroyed their own careers with prejudice and pride. Alicia Carter, on the other hand, had gained something far more powerful. Respect that no one could ever take away. And so the tale closed, not with anger, not with revenge, but with truth. Prejudice had handcuffed her. Dignity had freed her, and history had written the rest.